At 66, Cesar Romero finally spoke their names, the men he loved in secret. They called him the Latin lover. The smile, the charm, the effortless grace that turned Cesar Romero into one of Hollywood's most enduring icons. For decades, he danced through roles as kings, rebels, villains, even the unforgettable Joker. But when the cameras stopped rolling, when the parties ended and the tuxedo came off, what remained was a man alone and a truth he had buried for far too long. At 66, long after the applause had faded and the world had stopped asking, Cesar finally did something no one expected. He opened his heart, not to reporters or memoirs, but to a single old friend in Palm Springs. What he shared that day wasn't a confession. It was a remembering, quiet, careful, and deeply human. 6 names, 6 men. Each carried a piece of him. The first was a leading man, the one who stayed the longest. The second, a fleeting fire, gone before anyone noticed. But the third name was the one that made the air go still. A name so surprising, so protected, that even now the world still denies it. A name tied to longing, to sacrifice, and to a single choice that shaped a lifetime. "I lost him," Cesar said, "because I lived by a script someone else wrote for me." This is not tabloid fantasy. This is history, not the one written in magazines, but in memory. And for the first time, you're about to hear it. All of it, number 6, Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power, the one who saw him, Cesar Romero's first and quietest love. He was the golden boy of Hollywood. Tyrone Power, the man with a face so perfect the camera never looked away. Women adored him, men envied him, and every studio wanted his name on a marquee. But behind the tailored suits and charming smirks was a life far more complicated. And behind him, always just one step behind, was Cesar Romero. They met in a world built on illusion. Tyrone, young, magnetic, rising fast. Cesar, older, seasoned, and already fluent in the language of discretion. To the public, they were close friends. To those who dared to look closer, they were something else entirely. Quiet dinners, extended vacations, gentle touches exchanged in shadows. No headlines, no statements, just a closeness too constant to ignore. Scotty Bowers, the man who claimed to know everyone's secrets, would later say they were inseparable. "Cesar doted on him," he once whispered, "not like a fling, like someone who knew the cost of keeping a heart hidden." Tyrone, for all his fame, never found peace in the public image he was forced to play. He married, yes, more than once, but the smile in those wedding photos never quite reached his eyes. Cesar never judged him. He understood because he too had spent a lifetime pretending. Pretending that red carpets and scripted romance were enough, pretending that silence was safety. Years later, long after Tyrone passed, someone asked Cesar about him. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny. He just smiled sadly and said, "He was the one who saw me. Not the mask, not the name, me. Maybe they never got to love each other out loud. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe some love stories aren't measured in declarations, but in the way two souls recognize each other, even in a room full of lies." Number 5, Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz, the one who danced in the dark, Cesar Romero's briefest flame. Before he was America's beloved Ricky Ricardo, before the bright lights of I Love Lucy and the legacy of television royalty, Desi Arnaz was just another ambitious heart trying to make it in a city built on performance. He was bold, magnetic, and danced like he was born on stage. And somewhere in the early whirlwind of that rise, he met Cesar Romero. Cesar had already seen it all by then. The promises, the casting couches, the men who smiled too wide. But there was something about Desi, a hunger, a vulnerability he tried to mask with charm and rhythm. To the outside world, Desi was all swagger. But to Cesar, he was a quiet storm. And for a short, shimmering moment, they collided. They were seen together at rooftop parties, slipping out of back doors, sharing drinks that lingered into mornings. Hollywood didn't notice, not yet. Desi was still on the cusp of stardom, and Cesar knew how to keep secrets wrapped in silk. Some say Cesar offered him guidance. Others say it was comfort. But to the few who saw behind the curtain, it was something tender and real. Desi would go on to marry Lucille Ball, becoming half of the most iconic couple in television history. But long before the sitcom scripts and studio lights, there was one weekend at the coast. A beach house no one photographed. A song no one recorded. Desi played guitar. Cesar listened. And for a moment, neither of them were acting. Years later, when someone brought up Desi's name in passing, Cesar didn't flinch. He only smiled, that soft, private smile he reserved for memories too fragile to speak aloud. and said he danced like the world was watching, but he kissed like it wasn't. Number 4. Richard Chamberlain. Some flames burn fast. Others leave smoke that lingers for years. Richard Chamberlain, the one who needed shelter, a mirror to Cesar Romero's past. By the early 1960s, Richard Chamberlain was television's newest obsession, the handsome, soft-spoken Dr. Kildare, who made millions swoon from their living rooms. But behind the fame was fear, the kind of fear Cesar Romero had lived with for decades. And one night, at a gala in the hills of Bear, those two lives quietly intersected. Richard was still new to the machine, dressed in his best tuxedo, nervous in the way only someone hiding a part of themselves can be. Cesar, older and unshaken, sat beside him at the dinner table, elegant as ever, with eyes that had seen too much to judge. They talked, laughed, and according to those who watched them from across the room, they disappeared before dessert. No cameras followed, no tabloids caught a scent. But something happened that night, something Chamberlain would never fully explain. He would later refer in an interview to an older actor who made him feel safe when everything else felt performative. He never named him, but those close to Richard always suspected. Over the years, the two men met a few more times, always in private, always brief. It was never a romance in the public sense. No declarations, no crises, no tearful endings. Just two men at different ends of their careers, both fluent in silence, both craving something genuine. For Richard, Cesar was a map, a living example of how to survive the industry with grace, even when grace required heartbreak. For Cesar, Richard was a reflection of who he once was and of how far he had come. Years later, after Chamberlain finally came out, a journalist asked him if he had ever loved someone who could never love him back out loud. He paused, then said quietly, "Once he taught me how to smile when I wanted to run." Sometimes the deepest connections aren't loud. They don't burn, they hold, just long enough to keep a soul from breaking. Number 3. Rock Hudson, the one who hid best, Cesar Romero's silent equal. In the Hollywood of the 1950s and 60s, no man wore the mask better than Rock Hudson. He was tall, impossibly handsome, and draped in every fantasy the studios could imagine. Women fainted. Directors fought for his time. But behind the strong jaw and scripted charm was a man carrying a secret, one he thought might bury him if ever spoken aloud. Cesar Romero understood that secret long before the world suspected, because he too had carried it for a lifetime. They weren't lovers, at least not in the stories told in hushed tones, but they moved in the same circles, exchanged glances at the same studio functions, and occasionally shared late-night conversations that meant more than headlines ever could. Cesar had long mastered the art of survival. Rock was still learning how to breathe beneath the weight of pretending. And in that imbalance there was a strange bond, the kind that doesn't require touching to be intimate. Some insiders whispered that Cesar introduced Rock to certain directors, men who knew how to protect their own. Others say Romero merely offered a look across the room when the noise got too loud. Whatever the truth, both men lived double lives so convincing they almost believed them. On screen, Rock kissed Doris Day. Off-screen, he kissed shadows, and Cesar watched, not with envy, but with recognition. Years later, when the world learned Rock's truth under the cruel spotlight of illness and panic, Cesar said nothing publicly. He didn't have to, because in a room of reporters and flashing bulbs, Rock Hudson had once told a friend, "There was one man in this business who never asked me to lie. He just looked at me like he already knew. And that was enough." Some love stories aren't written in romance. They're written in quiet mercy, when one man gives another permission to exist without asking for anything in return. Number 2, Anthony Perkins. Anthony Perkins, the one who couldn't stay. A glimpse Cesar Romero never forgot. He was the beautiful boy who became a haunted man. Anthony Perkins, with his nervous smile and hollow eyes, didn't just play tortured roles, he lived them. The world remembers him as Norman Bates, forever frozen in that shower curtain scene. But behind the screen was a soul always running from fear, from judgment, and sometimes from love. Cesar Romero met him not through a film set or a studio dinner, but at a small gathering in the hills, a party where masks were easier to wear than truth. Perkins was young then, jittery, brilliant, magnetic in that fragile way that made you want to protect him. Romero, by contrast, was calm, composed, the kind of man who had learned long ago how to suffer silently without breaking. That night they talked in a corner while the rest of the party danced. Not about movies, not about fame, but about silence and how heavy it was to carry. Some said they disappeared for an hour. Others said they left together. What truly happened between them is unclear. And maybe that's the point, because not every story is about grand passion. Some are just brief sanctuaries, two men sharing breath in a world that refused to let them breathe. Perkins would later marry, have children, and continue pretending until the end. But friends of Romero said he kept a photograph of Anthony tucked in an old book. Not a headshot, but a candid, laughing reel. When asked about it, Cesar once murmured, "He reminded me of everything I couldn't fix and everything I once wished I could." There are people who don't stay. Not because they don't care, but because the world never gave them a map. Cesar didn't try to hold Anthony. He simply held the memory quietly like a glass that would break if spoken too loudly. Because some love isn't meant to last. It's meant to be remembered gently and always. Number 1. Scotty Bowers. Scotty Bowers. The one who knew. Cesar Romero's keeper of secrets. He wasn't a star. He didn't walk red carpets or sign autographs. But behind every polished Hollywood smile in the 1940s and 50s, Scotty Bowers stood just outside the frame, quiet, loyal, and dangerous in what he knew. They called him a bartender, a marine, a hustler, but to men like Cesar Romero, he was something else, a lifeline. Scotty never judged. He didn't need to. He knew the rules and how unfair they were. He ran a gas station by day and by night, arranged meetings that allowed closeted stars to feel, if only for a moment, like they belonged. Cesar Romero was among them. According to Scotty's later memoirs, Romero was kind, generous, a gentleman to the core, and very specific about what he wanted and who he trusted. They weren't lovers. But in a town where truth was currency, Scotty became the vault. He arranged encounters for Cesar with young men, sometimes actors, sometimes soldiers on leave, always discreet. There were no paparazzi, no risks, only brief sanctuaries built on silence. And in return, Cesar treated him not like a fixer, but like a friend. He never looked down on Scotty. Perhaps because he knew the man who keeps your secrets often knows your soul best. Years later, when Scotty published his tell-all igniting controversy across Hollywood, many denied, others panicked. But Cesar had already passed, never having spoken publicly about any of it. And Scotty, even in his most revealing pages, treated Romero with a tenderness reserved for very few. He never hurt anyone, Scotty wrote. He just wanted to feel close to someone, and for a while I helped make that possible. By the time Cesar Romero reached his 70s, the calls had slowed. The scripts, once endless, came only for cameos or nostalgia. The parties grew smaller, the questions gentler. No one asked about marriage anymore. They assumed he had simply chosen solitude. The charming bachelor, the eternal gentleman. But solitude was never his choice. It was his sentence. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews about the loves that shaped him. Because to speak them aloud would have been betrayal, not of people, but of the world that never gave them permission to exist. And so those names lived only in memory. Whispered, protected, sacred. Tyrone, the one who saw him before the mask ever hardened. Desi, the flame that flared and vanished. Richard, the frightened boy who reminded him of himself. Rock, the mirror he never dared touch. Tony, the ache of what could never stay. And Scotty, the man who knew all and asked for nothing. Each one a chapter. Each one a bruise that never turned to scar. In his final years, those who visited him spoke of how sharp his mind remained, how he'd tell stories with sparkle in his eyes. But there were stories he saved for the silences, the ones he told only in glances toward an empty chair or a sigh that hung too long in the air. He once said offhandedly to a friend, "I've been loved deeply, just not publicly." And maybe that was enough. Maybe not, but it was what the world allowed. When he passed in 1994, the obituaries spoke of roles, of elegance, of a man who lived a full and private life. They listed no partners, no survivors, but distant relatives. But if you listened closely, not to the articles, but to the spaces between the sentences, you might hear it. A name or six, because some men don't leave behind love letters. They leave behind silence, and sometimes silence is the loudest truth of all. He never stopped loving.